Hello and welcome to our AIES podcast, Politics on Point. This special series of 4 podcast episodes will be covering a broad range of different topics relevant to the European Union as a global actor series in collaboration with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation here in Vienna. My name is Michael Zinkanell. I'm the director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy and the host of today's episode on the topic of EU-ASEAN relations, potentials for enhanced cooperation. In this episode, we will be discussing some of the most pressing issues in the ASEAN region and the wider Indo-Pacific, how to overcome them, and opportunities also for enhanced EU-ASEAN cooperation in an increasingly fragile geopolitical atmosphere. I am delighted to welcome our expert speaker for today's session. We are joined today by Choi Shing Kwok, the Director and Chief Executive Officer of ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. The ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute is one of the leading research centers dedicated to the study of socio-political, security, and economic trends and developments in Southeastern Asia and its wider geostrategic and economic development. The Institute is based in Singapore, and we are joined today by the Director and CEO, Mr. Choi, who also holds the role of the head of the ASEAN Studies Center at the Institute since March 2020. In addition to his position, he also holds a number of board and advisory appointments on companies, charities, and research establishments in Singapore. Mr. Choi, thank you very much for joining us today.
My privilege altogether.
We would like to start today's podcast with the first question on the current developments also related to the war in Ukraine. As evident by the voting behavior of the UN General Assembly, the ASEAN countries seem to have a somewhat divided point of view and standpoint on the war in Ukraine. Does the war create discord amongst ASEAN member states, and how does ASEAN's ambivalent stance relate to the EU's comparably unified stance on the matter?
Well, Michael, I think you are absolutely right that there are quite a wide range of responses from Southeast Asian countries to the war in Ukraine. So they range from Singapore that imposed unilateral sanctions, and perhaps also in the same end is Cambodia, who co-sponsored the UN resolution against Russia. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have Laos and Vietnam, who abstain from most of the UN resolutions. And I would like to explain that there are a mixture of reasons for the differing responses, and it is very much connected to divergent national interests and histories. So on Singapore's part, I think it can be understood that Singapore finds the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity to be very important, related to its own very small geographical size and also its rather tumultuous history before its independence. Cambodia has its own history of having been invaded, and perhaps this time around it took a more forward position because it was chairing ASEAN in the year in which they had to make this stand. Indonesia was chairing G20, so it had to maintain some kind of a neutrality in order to fulfill its responsibilities, in order to also have the kind of bandwidth to engage with both sides who are also involved in G20. And we should also understand that on Vietnam's point of view, their entire military armament, stock inventory actually is almost entirely dependent on Russian sales and, of course, their follow-up support. Vietnam and Laos also have had very strong historical links to Moscow, and I think this is not something they could ditch overnight. Having said that, I would like to say also that the war did not really create significant discord between ASEAN states because it was not really deemed as an existential issue by countries here. Hence, most initial ASEAN statements for that reason became very bland, and I'm sure it is very disappointing to people who stood strongly against the invasion, including some ASEAN countries who were more forward-leaning. But while the fact of the war being rather distant played a big part in the earlier responses, I think this became less so when the impact of the things like the high energy prices, high food prices, and also high fertilizer prices began to actually come home to Southeast Asia around the second half of 2022. So by the time the EU-ASEAN Commemorative Summit came about in December 2022, I think that's when there was, in that sense, I think finally a consensus to name Russia and to also make a statement against its aggression outright.
Probably as a very small follow-up question to this matter, would you dare to give our listeners a little bit of a outlook, a trend, how this might change in the next 6 to 12 months? We're recording this episode in June. If we take a look at the situation towards the end of the year, end of 2023, will that change? Do you think there might be an impact, or will the stance of the ASEAN countries remain the same?
I think mostly they will remain around the same. As we all know, although the high energy and food prices were a problem, they kind of went away, and maybe right at this point in time, it's not so serious. Having said that, we don't know what's going to happen over the next 6 months. It could come back again. Then we don't know whether that becomes there's greater sort of interest in trying to bring about some kind of resolution that then makes all these collateral problems easier to manage. But I think the fundamental interests remain, and the fact that there is a divergence between ASEAN's stance and that of the EU, I think will remain somewhat different. Because I think for the EU, this is something that's really very existential, very proximate, and also very emotionally linked to very recent experiences by some European countries. So the stakes are very high, and when the stakes are so high, they tend to focus one's attention very much, and I think the level of risk aversion goes much higher. This is not the case for most ASEAN countries, and even if those problems were to come back, there are a number of other factors, and perhaps there are also a number of other narratives that actually have a resonance, and they are considered together with the sense of what's happening in Europe, how that would play against these other factors. So I think this would remain fundamentally the same even going forward 6 months.
Very interesting. Yeah. Thank you very much. Moving from the European geopolitical sphere and the war in Ukraine to more the ASEAN region, our next question would concern, in particular, the current ASEAN chair, Indonesia. Indonesia has voted to take a stronger stance against the military junta in Myanmar. However, with no consensus amongst the ASEAN member states, the scope of action remains rather limited. So my question would be, how can ASEAN as a whole, or Indonesia in specific, address the Myanmar issue? And is there the opportunity that the European Union can also take a stronger position as a partner in doing that?
Yeah, I think perhaps it's good to remember that the 2021 military coup in Myanmar, it is a new development, but it didn't really come out of the blue. The military in Myanmar has played a very strong and important institutional and political role in Myanmar since its independence way back in 1948. So the 2021 coup, to put it kind of more objectively, is simply the latest in a series of developments that have troubled the country for a long time. And I think that with that backdrop, I think the perhaps the countries in the region understand that this is not a problem that's going to be solved in a very short time and will probably not be resolved in the kind of complete and total manner that perhaps one would like. So you must not forget that even Aung San Suu Kyi herself first became prominent by being the daughter of an important national military figure. So the military has long history in Myanmar being involved in national affairs. And while some would like them to exit the scene, it is not so easily achieved and may also have consequences that perhaps we do not fully understand. So ASEAN, I think is mindful of this. ASEAN played an important role in the past to get Myanmar to the kind of political and economic state that it was in just prior to the coup. And therefore, I think it has a strong commitment and also a vested interest in trying to get it out of the mess that it is in now. However, as you have pointed out, I think there are divergent interests among different ASEAN member states, and getting a consensus for new policy directions is not going to be easy. Such differences that exist are quite natural in the sense that there are those which have common borders with Myanmar, and they would feel the security and other perhaps economic concerns more acutely than those who are a bit further away. So the 5-point consensus, which was pulled together 3 months after the coup actually took place, still represents, I would say, the common plan that all ASEAN member states agreed to. And that included actually the SAC, the Myanmar military, who were participating in that meeting. Although immediately after the meeting, the SAC quite quickly disavowed that they had agreed to the 5-point consensus and have consistently resisted trying to bring it back. I think equally importantly, the parties that are in the opposition against the military have also rejected the 5-point consensus. And they have resisted things like the channeling of humanitarian aid through the military areas and through the military's help. And they have also resisted starting a dialogue with the military, which would have been one part of the 5-point consensus as well. So 2023 will be a critical year for ASEAN to try and regain some momentum on the Myanmar crisis. We are about halfway through 2023 already. There have been and there still remain high hopes for Indonesia to make some kind of breakthrough as the chair. It has been, as you have pointed out, one of the grouping's most vocal countries on the coup and its aftermath. It was the one that actually pushed for the first ASEAN leaders meeting, the special ASEAN leaders meeting that actually came out with a 5-point consensus in April that year. So upon assuming its chairmanship this year, I think Indonesia has taken a proactive as well as a energetic role in trying to move things on Myanmar. They've had many engagements with a wide range of different stakeholders inside Myanmar as well as outside Myanmar, including engaging with parties like the EU, India, Japan, and also the US. as well as the UN Special Envoy. So it is hoping to have a coordinated approach, working with all these stakeholders. The other significant thing I think that Indonesia has done is that it has set up an office of the Special Envoy. The ASEAN chair has always appointed a Special Envoy, but they have not had an office, a specific office assigned to do just the work related to Myanmar. Indonesia has changed this, and they have actually put a veteran diplomat to help the Special Envoy, who is usually the foreign minister. And with these additional resources, I think that Indonesia is giving it a serious go. It is also been stated, I think Indonesia has said they will have also tried to bring in military or ex-military figures from their own side to try and help bridge the gap with the SAC. So I think this is the kind of push that Indonesia is trying to bring together during this year. However, as we've said, it's half a year gone, and there's quite a lot of activity, but we haven't really seen any breakthroughs. So if I may go to the part about how can the EU help, clearly there's no silver bullet. It is a very difficult situation. What is helpful is for the EU and ASEAN to coordinate on the subject, because it can be possible that there may be some activity that may be that may end up being at cross purposes. So it's good that both sides try to avoid this. So Indonesia is likely to continue taking, I think, a low-key diplomatic approach rather than a high-profile one. They will speak to the media, but not all the time, and certainly not after every meeting. I think in terms of tone, this will be a bit at odds with the EU's approach and the EU's style. But I think it's always a strength to be trying different approaches. And if they are coordinated, then this becomes a strength rather than a weakness.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for the EU to understand the ASEAN approach under Indonesia's leadership, and perhaps also exercise a bit more patience to let their approach work while also continuing with their own approach on a coordinated way. Ultimately, I think both sides want the same outcome, which is to bring a halt to the violence and to deliver humanitarian aid to the people who are in need of it, and eventually, hopefully not too long, return to an administration that has some popular support from Myanmar people, which is clearly not the case right now.
Yeah. Definitely important to remember that the EU and ASEAN has common interests in solving this issue, and probably also the EU should live up more to its potential to also be an honest partner in doing so. Yeah. We're coming also to another question, to another topic that concerns the ASEAN region and also the EU-ASEAN relations. The EU, as we know, has emphasized the promotion of democracy, the promotion of human rights as part of its Indo-Pacific strategy. And regarding the upcoming general elections in Thailand and in Cambodia this year, there is some concern about the freeness and the fairness of these elections in Europe. My question would be, how can the EU's commitment to democracy and the ASEAN's principles of non-interference can be reconciled? And against this background, how could the elections in Cambodia and in Thailand impact EU-ASEAN relations?
Well, I think while there was some skepticism about the Thai general elections, now that it is over, I do believe that most observers agree that it was carried out freely, albeit within the boundaries of the existing constitution, which is um, a recent constitution. I think the actual election results also sort of speak for themselves because the incumbent parties um, who are related to I would say, the the more conservative establishment, as well as their leaders, they were actually rejected by the majority of voters. So obviously, there was, if there's any interference with the votes, it didn't deliver the kind of results that the incumbent liked. However, the game is not entirely over. Because a new prime minister has to be selected by the combined houses of parliament, and that includes a significant number of non-elected senators. And so the popular choice from the elections may not necessarily prevail under that system. So I think this is still very much in play, and so it continues to be something that the Election Commission in Thailand is still trying to work out, and also the various senators are trying to, I guess, work out their positions, how they would vote when that combined session is convened. But having said that, I must say that the elections themselves were obviously run fairly well, and I don't think there were complaints that it was not a free and a fair election. So the Cambodian elections will be even more controversial because the most prominent opposition party and some opposition figures were disqualified from contesting in the election. This development, I think the EU has spoken out against. Similarly, also on the part of the US, while ASEAN has not been able to issue any statement on this and does not intend to. There are really vast differences between the EU and ASEAN. Perhaps these differences are not so well understood by the general public, so let me just lay out a few of them. So firstly, I think Europe is far more homogeneous than Southeast Asia in both ethnic, religious terms, as well as in economic development terms. So secondly, there are institutional differences between the EU and ASEAN, with the EU being a supranational organization with powers to overrule its members in some areas, whereas ASEAN is actually an intergovernment association of sovereign countries. Thirdly, there are already a diverse group of political systems in ASEAN today, ranging from democracies to absolute monarchies to governments run by communist parties. So these systems are already divergent today, and they form part of the reality of ASEAN. So any kind of institutional commitment to a prescribed form of government like democracy is just not possible for ASEAN to think about or to talk about, much less to practice. And non-interference in domestic political affairs of between members is actually a necessary unifier for the ASEAN organization from the very beginning. However, I think that the Myanmar issue has shown that even this non-interference principle has its limits. And what has been done, I think we are all aware of. ASEAN has not allowed the military government from Myanmar to attend the ASEAN summit or its foreign ministers meeting since last year. So this is something that ASEAN is beginning to do despite its non-interference principle. Will this have an impact on ASEAN-EU relations? I think it depends on whether the EU wants to take a position against an individual country that affects the entire relationship with ASEAN as a grouping. I think most ASEAN countries would be hoping that unhappiness with developments in one country will not become multilateralized in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We will move now again from the regional perspective to the more global sphere for our last topic and last question. ASEAN, as well as its member states, have long pursued the strategy for non-alignment, especially vis-a-vis the increasing Sino-US rivalry, the rivalry between the US and China. How does ASEAN now view the EU in this context, and what role could or should the EU play vis-a-vis this increasing rivalry?
Okay. I think like other countries, ASEAN member states have been looking to do what is in their own interests in the midst of this global rivalry and global competition. It doesn't want to be a proxy for anyone. And in a summary, I would think that ASEAN countries are really looking for three things that are in their own interests. Firstly, I think they want to try to preserve peace and stability in the region. Southeast Asia has been a region of war and instability until as late as the late 1970s. And it was only after that, less than 50 years ago, that the region has experienced peace and could focus on economic growth. Secondly, I think that the region would like to pursue economic growth as it has been able to do the last 40 plus years. They want to be able to trade. They want to be able to make investment deals with all interested parties without restriction, rather than to have to deal only with some. And this is consistent from the past too, because, for example, the Japanese and the Americans are were both enemies in the past to some countries in ASEAN, but they were welcomed back. So it is similarly without this kind of restriction that countries have been trying to pursue economic growth in Southeast Asia. Thirdly, I think they would like to have a measure of agency or control over regional developments rather than to have to fit into anyone else's agenda. And often people would refer to this as a form of ASEAN centrality. So I think that's what's behind it, is that the region wants to have its own say over how the region would be governed. So in the State of Southeast Asia survey, which my ASEAN Studies Center does, of all 10 regional countries' opinion makers, the conclusion from that study shows that the EU is the top choice, actually, of third party for hedging against the uncertainties between the US and China in their rivalry. This was the choice of about 43% of the voters, of the respondents in ASEAN. Japan is second, but quite a long way behind at 27%. So not challenging the EU's positioning in that sense. And then further back, you get India and Australia, who are only at 10 or 11%. So like ASEAN, I believe that the EU's interest is not totally aligned with the US in its relationship with China. It is aligned in many ways, but it's not totally aligned, and it's somewhat that we're therefore in a similar position to ASEAN. And there's therefore greater room for understanding and cooperation in that respect, I think, between the two regions. So EU has got room to play. The same survey also shows that it is actually Japan that is the most trusted major power of ASEAN countries in terms of doing the right thing. So Japan was trusted by 55% of the respondents to our survey, but Europe is not far behind at 51%. So it's also fairly well trusted. Majority do trust Europe, and the reason that that's the case is because the respondents believe that the EU is committed to human rights, to climate action, to international law. So there is a lot of common ground between what the EU believes and what the region believes in. And perhaps it is only the style of engagement and diplomacy that may need to be somewhat adapted. There is, however, I must also flag out from the survey that some skepticism about Europe's political will and capacity because it is seen as preoccupied with internal affairs. So it remains to be noted that I think that Europe has taken on a stronger role recently in the region, and Joseph Borrell has spoken at the Shangri-La Dialogue, I think just recently, a week plus ago. So this is a good development that Europe is trying to dispel this skepticism of its capacity and political will to be involved. What kind of role can the EU play? I think that there is a role security-wise. I think that it can complement the US as an external player in upholding international law and freedom of navigation and overflight in the region. But the main part of Europe's continued commitment, I think, should come on the economic side. It's already a big player. It should continue to build upon its investments and integration with the region. Of course, the big strategic move is ASEAN EU FTA. But I understand that the EU is still working on single country FTAs for the time being, because it's already negotiating those single country FTAs. But I think the region will hope that it probably is not too long before it can go to a region-to-region FTA. Perhaps the final area I would just flag out is that the EU can play a big role in the energy transition for the region.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this is also something where it has experience and also technologies that are salient to the challenges of the ASEAN countries.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Choi, for pointing out that very broad scope of different potential cooperation in the EU-ASEAN relations. I think that based on the acknowledgement and emphasis that you have made that the EU has already taken a stronger stance towards the region, this can even be enhanced in the future, also based on the potentials, based on the topics that we have pointed out today during this podcast episode. I would like to thank you, Mr. Choi, Director and CEO of the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, based in Singapore, for your time and for sharing your profound expertise on the matter with us. This has been a special AIES Politics on Point podcast on the topic of EU-ASEAN relations, potentials for enhanced cooperation, that has been conducted in cooperation with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation here in Vienna. My name is Michael Zinkanell, and I've been your host today. Thank you very much for listening, and stay tuned.